Welcome to Transqat. I'm Claire McCarthy. When she was first elected to the Vermont House of Representatives in 2020, Taylor Small became part of a very select group of out transgender people holding elected office. She's running for re-election this fall and took time away from her campaign for a lively conversation here on Transqat. I'm pretty sure that as a Connecticut resident, I'm not allowed to vote in Vermont, but if I could, she'd have my vote because she is awesome. Representative Taylor Small, welcome to Transqat. Thank you so much for taking time away from your campaign to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Claire. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
You recently got back from Manchester, which when I first saw it come across my social media feed, my reaction was, well, big deal. I go to Manchester all the time. They have an IMAX theater there. And then I realized, oh, not that Manchester.
It's why everyone keeps saying I went to London instead.
Yeah.
They just forget that there's a whole other Manchester.
Yeah. But tell us about what you were doing in Manchester and the award you received there and how that whole event went.
Yeah, I was invited out to Manchester, England for what's called the One Young World Summit. It's an annual summit that brings together young leaders from around the world to be able to highlight the work that they're doing in their home countries, inspire others into the work, and really just have 4 days to think about how we revolutionize and really change the world from a young perspective. And one of the ways that they do it is not only through kind of panels and discussions, but also through awards. So there's 3 main awards that they give out: Entrepreneur of the Year, Journalist of the Year, and then Politician of the Year. And it's all focused on folks 18 to 35.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was actually flown out because I won Young Politician of the Year, the only one from the United States.
Congratulations.
To be granted that.
Oh, that's
Thank
wonderful.
you so much.
Yeah. You have been putting on your social media feed some excerpts from an interview that you did while you were there. And one of them really resonated with me, but they were asking about 3 things. It's the top 3 things that prevent women from becoming leaders in the political realm. And you listed first and foremost misogyny. And I believe that transphobia and homophobia are really just flavors of misogyny. So I wanted to throw that back to you and see what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, it was a really beautiful panel. I got to sit on 2 panels. I swear they ran me across this conference center after I had won the award to get me right onto stage afterwards to speak on this panel. And so the second of the 2 that you referenced was around women in politics. And so there were 2 other women who won the award for Politician of the Year with me. And we were each kind of sharing what the unique barriers are. It was supposed to be focused on our home country. And yet I think the ones that I listed of misogyny, opportunity, and pay inequity are pretty global when we're talking about barriers for anyone who holds a marginalized identity, but in particular women. And I think to your point, misogyny really has been kind of the undercurrent of what I've been pushing up against. It hasn't necessarily been my transness per se, though I think there's a lot of trans misogyny that comes out in these spaces, or my youngness even, but really this piece of what it means to be a woman and how to show up with your feminine side in these spaces, which is often where folks try to oppress you. Is why would you want to show up as feminine? Why would you want to lean into that aspect of yourself? Why aren't you going to be that argumentative, masculine, butch presence? That's the unemotional way that we make policy work. And yet, as I close that introduction of misogyny being the biggest barrier, I really just recognize that we put all of these expectations on women of how they are allowed or should show up in spaces such as the political realm. And yet men have been so incompetent in the way that they show up. And yet it goes unpoliced or unfazed as to why there is this double standard or lack of standards for folks who identify as men versus those who identify as women. And I would rather see the equity component of we just see representation that is reflective of the people that we serve. And I know that's a long shot, a dream goal, but I think it's attainable if we try to lessen those barriers to the work.
I saw an interview with you and our mutual friend John Kalaki, where he was giving you just heaps of praise for one of the pieces of legislation that we're gonna come back to in a bit here, but saying that this passed because you educated folks, and that's not the way we're accustomed to hearing that politics work. Educating people to bring them to a consensus. Tell me about that.
Well, let me start with my immense gratitude and love for John Kalaki. He is, such a breath of fresh air. And, it's always so validating to have folks within your community serving alongside you, to be able to provide that mentorship and guidance, but also this level of support that you don't necessarily get, especially in political spheres. And I really appreciate your point around what we assume politics is like. And I would say in a majority of spaces, that is how politics is working. It's working by making deals. It's working by convincing others, not because they're changing their belief system or values, but more because it will work for them in the long run. And so my work before coming into the legislature was focused on education. So it's very easy for me to fall back on that, as you could say. And so I work for the Pride Center of Vermont, our statewide LGBTQ center here in the state of Vermont, where I did a lot of training for healthcare and human service providers around LGBTQ plus competency. And it didn't, I guess John is very generous in saying that I educated folks. I would say I just had the conversation. I encouraged folks to really enter into dialogue. I wanted to know what their hangups were, what they didn't understand about the legislation, what they didn't understand about the identities that were being reflected there, and really just start at that. It feels so simple to give them the basic information of now you know what you're voting on. And that is really what turned folks around. I wouldn't say that it was a lot of persuasion. It was just a lot of empathy and recognizing each other's humanity, which I think is the transformational leadership that we need in the future. Well,
absolutely.
This is the future. But it really is, it's a team effort. I could not do the work that I did in the first 2 years in serving if it wasn't for the groundwork that had been laid before me, for the LGBTQ folks who were already in office, who made sure that we had discrimination protections, that we had marriage equality, that we had to, do that little step through civil unions and then marriage equality, and all that education that came before me that allowed me to come in and provide the education of today. But I think that's something that Vermont has modeled for me in the political world, is seeing beyond the identity politics, whether that is the identities that you hold or the party label that you hold. I think that's something we really value here, is being able to talk across the aisle, not because we want our issues to move forward, but because we're all in this work together. And it's better when you actually know the person that's sitting next to you, right. And building those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine one of the challenges to that, though, is that you have a 2-year term. And so establishing those sorts of mentorship relationships must be difficult when it comes and goes. John did not run again this year. So what does the legislature look like in terms of an LGBTQ caucus this year?
Well, the hope is that we'll maintain our number. So Vermont actually had the largest LGBTQ caucus in our state legislature compared to any other state this past session. We had 14 out LGBTQ legislators across both our House and Senate. including Senator Becca Balint, who was the president pro tem of the Senate. So just some amazing leadership. And so though folks have retired and though folks like Senator Balint are moving up in the world and hopefully going to be our first Congresswoman of Vermont, I know that there are new folks who are just as excited to come in and keep the conversation moving forward. Because though there are a lot of protections in Vermont, there's a lot of anxiety as to what's happening on the national scale.
Yes.
Especially with Roe versus Wade being overturned, and knowing that that is just one of many rights that might be on the line for us as Americans.
Absolutely. And you are running for re-election during a campaign season when the National Republican Party has made anti-trans legislation one of their platform planks. That's got to be challenging as you look at what's coming up.
Oh gosh, I think to my first time running through a global pandemic, where all I saw across the nation was I think a total of 144 bills that tried to limit rights and access to things such as education, healthcare, mental health supports. For LGBTQ youth in particular. So it's no surprise that this is going to continue. And of course, that anxious piece in the back of my head is, how will this impact us in Vermont? Will that rhetoric follow through? Or will we be able to overcome that by focusing more on those relationships that we've been able to establish and really build upon?
Let's talk about the accomplishments in your first term. We were alluding to before HR 128, which passed and was, I hope I'm explaining this correctly, made it illegal to use the gay or trans panic defense. Maybe we should start. I mean, I'm assuming that listeners know what that is, but maybe we should explain it.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if there are listeners who don't know. Because it's surprising that we can even refer to this as a defense in the first place.
Right.
So the gay trans panic defense is a defense that's used in our judicial system to allow folks to either reduce or to be acquitted of their crimes committed against LGBTQ folks. And the typical stories that we hear where this defense is used is where a gay man comes on to a straight man, and that straight man feels, as he would say, a sense of panic, but really it's this questioning of his own identity, being perceived as gay. And so instead of just simply saying no or rejecting the advance, turning to a place of assault or murder. And more commonly, what we see is for trans women, where if they are passing, would be outed in that moment, and then again either assaulted or murdered for simply being trans and looking for a relationship, or even not, just people questioning themselves and their own identity. And so in Vermont, the last time that defense was used actually was in 1991, and it was a time where we actually had an LGBTQ bar here in Vermont called Pearls. And a gentleman was leaving the bar. Two other folks followed him afterwards, tried to come on to him, realized that he was a gay man, and then proceeded to assault him pretty brutally. Luckily, that defense, it didn't fly in the court then, but I think anytime we leave that door open is just one where we're inviting discrimination, bias, and prejudice within our judicial system.
And of course, this, sorry to jump in there, but this is, the event you're describing is what, about 7 or 8 years before Matthew Shepard?
Yeah.
Which is really the case that brought this gay panic defense to the fore in the public conversation.
And so when I was talking to folks about this defense, and, you know, first and foremost, trying to educate them that this is blaming the victim. We never in our system want to encourage blaming the victim of a crime as the reason that the crime was committed. And second, that it hasn't been used, which was a deterrent for some folks of, why are we doing this? If it hasn't been used, and it didn't work the first time. Why would we think that it would work again? And I always came back to the piece of let it be a political statement that we see and honor the LGBTQ people of Vermont, and that we don't ever believe that they should be considered, well, one, they shouldn't be a victim of any crime, and two, they shouldn't be blamed as the victim of a crime. And that is really where folks came around and got the unanimous support of the House and Senate, and our Republican governor, which was really just, as I said time and time again, the most heartwarming welcome into this political world. Because, you know, I was nervous to be advocating in my first year for a policy that would directly impact me and my community. I worried that I would be seen as a single issue politician, that I'd only be going in, quote unquote, uh, to make things better for just one aspect of my identity. And luckily, it wasn't received that way. It felt more like this was something that was overlooked, and it actually took someone with lived experience and knowledge to be able to push that issue through and to make sure that we got it passed as quickly as we did.
Pointing again to the value of having an LGBTQ caucus, right? Where there's context, and you're less likely to be labeled as this, one issue candidate. As long as you bring that up, the questions about your first term that I had for you were mostly on queer themes, but what are the other issues that matter as you are running for this second term?
That work actually inspired me to continue updating and revising our judicial system here in Vermont. What I've actually recently come to learn is that we're lacking when it comes to protections of youth involved in our judicial system. Currently, Vermont is one of the few states that allows children as young as 10 years old to be charged as adults in our legal system. And we're still working on what it means to rehabilitate and provide treatment for young folks and youthful offenders, rather than just exacerbating the school to prison pipeline that we have heard too often about, where we're not allowing folks to really reconnect and learn from their transgressions, and instead are keeping them locked up and behind bars, which is only further alienating them from community and opportunities for rehabilitation.
Setting them up for failure.
You said it, and I would wholeheartedly agree. It's one of those growing edges, though, because there are so many folks who are still determined and believe in the way that we have set up our carceral system. And I really think that we're doing a disservice to our communities if we aren't looking for a more transformational change or model that focuses on why the crime was committed in the first place. I think people look to our prison system and think that's where all the murderers and the rapists and sexual assaulters and people who commit these violent, horrific crimes are held. And yet when we look at the data, especially here in Vermont, when we look at the data, it is folks who are held up on drug crimes, folks who are in need of treatment for substance use disorder and are instead held in a prison. We're focused on folks who are doing petty theft and crime for meeting their basic needs of not being able to buy food or not being able to put clothes on their children's back or whatnot. And so when we dig into that level, we understand that if we want to keep folks out of prison, we need to focus on what the living situation is for the people who are currently housed in prisons, and how we can improve that outside and improve our social supports so that prisons can be an obsolete thing of the past. Is, call that my hot take of the podcast, but that
wouldn't that be wonderful? Yeah.
Wouldn't it, if we didn't have to have prisons anymore because people were just so well taken care of in their community?
The campaigns are obviously divisive. They're a zero-sum game, and we are incredibly divided right now. What is the value of policy? You're talking about how policies affect people, and how it affects the judicial system, particularly given that people are really dissatisfied with the way the system is working, what's the value of policy making?
Ooh, that is a beautiful question. Um, you know, where policy comes into play is I think of policy as our rule book. If we are looking at our systems and our systems are not fully taking care of the people in our communities, it's either that the rules aren't allowing them to do so,
Right.
or that it's I would say, potentially the worker themselves who are not doing the best of their support. I think the latter is few and far between. There are so many people who are working for the state and working for these systems who want to do the best for their community, but feel as though their hands are tied because of the ways that the rules have been set up for them, that they have to follow the procedures that were written instead of simply just meeting those needs. And so where policy comes into play is how we change that rule book to really focus on improving the work that is already being done within our communities and uplifting that. I think a perfect example of this was in my second year, we updated our state's welfare program. There's a lot of updates that need to be made, but one of them was the radical idea of removing work requirements. What was the purpose of work requirements in the program? The purpose was, of course, to encourage people to get back into the workforce, to not become dependent on state supports, and to really have that self-reliance.
And those came out of the Clinton era.
They did indeed. It's part of this, it's called TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And it really has four pillars. The four pillars are, this is not the exact verbatim, this is the Taylor version of the pillars, which is one, to maintain a two-parent household. First and foremost, let me say, I love that the language actually does say a two-parent household and does not promote heteronormativity. That it's preventing having children out of wedlock, or such as teenage pregnancy, to be able to support families in getting back into the workforce and to make sure that their basic needs are met. And so in Vermont, we had a work requirement that said that if you were part of the program, you had to work 30 hours a week. And that meant you got all your other benefits. And that, again, in theory, sounds good. Like, we're getting folks into the workforce, we're helping them out, they have a case manager. But the reality was we saw people working unpaid jobs because they just wanted to meet their work requirement and didn't want to lose any of their benefits. And if they worked a high enough paying job, they would lose their benefits, but still wouldn't be earning enough to meet their basic needs. And so by removing the work requirement, what we allowed people to do was to work with their case manager on what were your barriers to work. If you don't have transportation, so you can't get to your job, what is working 30 hours a week at unpaid labor going to help with getting transportation? Or if it's childcare, if you can't find a childcare provider, how are you supposed to do that if you're working 30 hours a week? It only gives you such limited time to be able to do it. So,
right. Or something that would link to a GED.
Oh gosh, one of the arbitrary rules was that only one parent was able to pursue education instead of both. And I was like, why? Why would we limit that opportunity? If both parents want to pursue education, well, let them do it.
One of the things that you come back to again and again, and actually it's beautifully visible on your campaign's website, is that you've approached your election in that first term as being empowering for queer youth.
Yeah.
And I agree with you 100% on that. I agree with what you've said many times, which is if you don't see yourself represented in the institution, the human assumption is, okay, I don't belong there. And I, as someone, I don't want to slip into the preaching elder here to you, but as somebody who was a teen in the 70s, that was every career. I never saw any trans teachers. And there were rumors about teachers being gay, but you couldn't be out and still have the job. And it shouldn't be that way.
Right.
What do you hope that your term in the legislature gives to queer kids in Vermont?
You know, I think at the most basic level, uh, it's really highlighting that you can be a thriving queer and trans adult. That it irregardless of the path that you were hoping to take, that the opportunity is there for you to live your best life. And I say it in the simple way of just focusing on living your life, because I still know that the suicide risk for LGBTQ youth is uh, it's heartbreaking
Yeah.
where it's at right now as a nation, and even here in Vermont, where I feel like we are on the leading end when it comes to supports in our schools, and definitely supports when it comes to our nonprofit realm. But I think beyond that, what I really hope is uh, that I'm not going to be the last. That's it's hard being the first out openly uh, trans representative in Vermont is an honor that I am so grateful to have, and to be able to lead for our community. And it's lonely because that's what it means to be the first, is that you're
Right.
alone in this work. Nobody else is holding that identity. Um, and what would be more upsetting to me is if I was the last. And I do not want, and I don't think that is an opportunity that's going to happen. Um, because what I've seen from trans youth is that they now see politics as a realm that they can go into. I see them starting to volunteer on campaigns that they hadn't done before. I even got to meet this trans woman who is in her first year of college and is doing canvassing for a local climate justice group. And she was talking to me about the difficulties of going door to door and having to explain pronouns, and, having people use the wrong pronouns in the process and how to get through it. And and I was the first person that she was able to talk to about it. She didn't feel like she could talk to the other canvassers about what was going on because they didn't have that same experience. But she was like, I have just wanted to ask you, like, how do you get through the drudge of going door to door and having people mess up pronouns, and have them mess up your name or make assumptions? And I was like, it doesn't get any easier. I hate to say it, it doesn't get any easier. But what does get easier is when you know that you got people on your side, and that you shouldn't, one, be doing that alone, and two, that it is those small conversations, that door knock where you correct someone on pronouns, that they are going to think about that the next time that they assume pronouns of the next person. And it's how we get that culture change, is by really normalizing having the conversation, the uncomfortable conversation about who we are, and sharing pieces of ourselves with others, that will get us to a point where that future trans woman, non binary, trans masculine person who's going out canvassing won't have that question again, because it's just going to be commonplace that we ask about pronouns, or that we get to declare who we are, and no one else is making those assumptions for us.
Precedent has been set.
Exactly.
Yeah. I came out at age 55, and so I already had a career and I had a job. And so it was easier for the community, both, within the school and within the community at large, to say, okay, well, that's new and different, but it's McCarthy. But
Mm.
nothing's really going to change except the wardrobe, and that might not be a bad thing. Uh, but I knew that I would not have been hired by this school if I walked into the interview as a trans woman. So I was hoping that my coming out might make that possible for somebody down the road. And along the lines of what you were saying, where you move the needle a little bit and then you let the next person move it a little further, and before you know it, there's progress.
Mm. Oh, and it makes me think, as we were talking about earlier, that I wouldn't have been able to move the needle in my first term if it wasn't for the movement that had happened before. I think of not only John Kalaki, but I think of Representative Bill Lippert, who is wrapping up a 30-year tenure in the Vermont legislature, a staple in discussions as the only gay man who was involved with a seat at the table, a deciding vote when it came to civil unions in Vermont, when it came to marriage equality, when it came to discrimination protections around gender identity and gender expression. He was there and he had to listen to some of the most horrendous things be said about our community and to take it with stride. The conversations, it was not a conversation back then. It was just a lot of vitriol and hate. And so to think that that is what he went through 30 years ago and through the process of his 30 years, to be able to then come to a point where we voted unanimously with no backlash to protect LGBTQ people from being blamed as the victim of a crime. I remember him just standing there in front of me, silent. He had no words. He could not explain to me what that meant for him to be in that space. And I will never forget that moment in my entire life of what might seem insignificant or challenging or just, heartbreaking actually is what is going to make the change that allows the next generation to be able to go even farther than we have.
Yeah. And the joy of that journey is that you don't necessarily know what it is that's going to spark somebody else. You don't know
Yeah.
which explanation or just showing up does to somebody who says, okay, then I can have my best life. This is within reach. I want to ask you about growing up and coming out. You grew up in Pittsfield.
I did.
You did, and I taught for about a dozen years in Williamstown. Uh, I taught at Mount Greylock, so I'm familiar with Pittsfield, and I think it's fair to say I don't want to cast any aspersions, but Williamstown is a college town, and so there's more. At least when I was teaching there in the 90s and early aughts, uh, it was a little more progressive. Pittsfield, not necessarily so.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. Now I've heard you talk about some of your experiences, and please tell me no if you don't want to. But would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Um, yeah, my upbringing was not smooth sailing by any means. Uh, my parents both come from a low income background. We were pretty poor growing up. For my first 5 years, my parents moved around from Maine to Vermont to New Hampshire about, oh gosh, it was 12 times before I turned five. And then because of economic security and being able to get jobs, my parents landed in Western Massachusetts in Pittsfield, where I then stayed for 10 years of my life. And what there were a lot of challenges. I formed some amazing, long-lasting relationships in Pittsfield, but the challenges are not that different than what we see today. We were having environmental challenges with a lot of issues with PCBs in the ground soil and in the water.
Right.
Growing up with classmates who had genetic deficiencies, with a lot of parents who passed away from cancer because of the PCBs there. Um, and a lot of judgment. There was, of course, still a lot of stigma and prejudice around being gay. And so, though I presented very feminine, I think our society has taught us that our gender presentation is more indicative of our sexuality or sexual orientation rather than our gender. So at the time, because I was assigned male at birth and presented femininely, folks immediately were like, oh, okay, so you are gay. And that was like, it was the accusation that was made constantly through middle school and through my first year of high school, was this accusation of being gay.
You said in an interview that there's a difference between someone asking, "Are you gay?" and that way of phrasing it that you're describing now. What are you, gay?
Yeah,
Where it's aggressive and it's an accusation, uh, and almost always comes before you've formed any sort of any sort of a sexual identity. You're still trying to figure out, how do I get through fourth grade?
exactly. And definitely not going to come out as gay if it's an accusation, because an accusation means it's something bad. It's something bad that you're telling me that I am.
Why, yes,
Um,
yes, I am.
yes. Um, but to your point, that's exactly the shift that I saw. So I didn't come out at all when I was in Massachusetts. It was extremely unsafe for me to do so because even without coming out, facing constant bullying and harassment and even physical assault from folks in my grade. But then I moved up to Vermont, and I remember when we crossed the border in 2010. I remember telling my mom, I was like, there's this is going to be a big change. There's going to be a big change. I don't know what it is, but there is something that is going to change. And I remember going to my new school starting sophomore year at Colchester High, and I was approached with the question. Folks still read the feminine energy that I was giving off, but instead of making that accusation, they just started asking,
Hmm.
are you gay? And I couldn't hear the difference at first. Um, but it was with time that I realized that the question meant that there was an answer, and that answer meant that you aren't deciding anything for me. And also, you're giving no connotation as to what that answer means. If I tell you no, you're going to be fine. If I tell you yes, you're still going to be fine. And so during my senior year, is when I first came out as gay, and was one of 8 people that year that came out as LGBT.
Wow.
Um, and it was beautiful. I mean, we had this community. It was kind of like once the first person came out and we saw the love that they received, everyone else was like, "Oh my God, thank you for doing it." It just so happened to be the like captain of our football team, which also helped
Oh,
with
wow.
all of that. But like a revolutionary time that, again, I wouldn't have never imagined for myself that I would go to Vermont and come out my senior year of high school as gay and be one of 8 people that was out and thriving. And yet that's what happened.
So you came out as gay in senior
Yeah.
year in high school. When did you start to suspect that trans was in the cards?
That was actually through my college career. So I started college as a pre-med major and switched to human development and family studies about halfway through, which allowed for a lot of introspection and understanding as to how we develop as people. There was a lot of work focused on understanding your own development journey to be able to then compare and contrast with theory as well as um, understanding what's happening biologically and naturally for us is also occurring for others. So it was through that time that I knew that I was not the gender that I was assigned at birth, but couldn't quite pinpoint it until my senior year. So then I just made it a trend that senior year was always the time to come out. It makes me nervous to go for like a further degree, such as like a master's or a doctorate, because gosh, I don't know if I have more to come out about myself. But I came out to my family during graduation weekend, and I didn't come out to my classmates until graduation day, and presented in my full femness for
Whoa.
graduation. And it was just a really beautiful beautiful experience, and had a lot of loving support, even though I didn't give them any forewarning, which it was a beautiful, what I tried to picture at the time as a closing of a chapter, but it really wasn't closing. I thought that's how it would have to be, was like, oh, people are going to remember me as this one way. And so I'm going to close that part and then I get to be my new self. But instead it was like, oh, this is just me sharing more. It's the book's going to keep going on. The chapter end doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. It is just one chapter.
Indeed. And look what's happened since.
Right. Nothing that I would have expected.
Right.
Um,
And also, probably nothing that would have happened if you hadn't been secure enough in yourself, if you hadn't had that community of support where you could be your authentic self. Because I would imagine that running for a public office demands being really well grounded in yourself as things swirl around you. Is that a reasonable description?
oh, that is a very reasonable description of what it means to be in public office. You do. You have to know yourself, and more importantly, you have to know your values, because we're constantly being asked to weigh in on decisions, whether that's a vote in our official capacity or offering commentary on what's happening on the state. And you can't just answer those questions. You can't know how to respond if you aren't solid in your value system, which I think everyone really pictures it as. You have to know every aspect of policy. You have to know every aspect of the state and what's going on so that you can be prepared. But really, if you know where your values lie, you can approach any issue from a value-based perspective and you have your answer clear as day.
What a wonderful answer. I the last 4 years of my teaching career, I was also the school librarian, and I know the value of lifelong love of reading. So that said, tell me about Nikki Champagne.
Oh, she is, I thought Nikki would be the detriment to my political career, and she has been anything but. Uh, so Nikki Champagne is my drag persona. She came into my life in 2014 when I first became interested in drag. Um, this was also a time of gender exploration for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always described, because folks are like, you're a trans woman who does drag, isn't drag specifically for people who are men who are performing as women.
Right.
And of course, we know it is so much more than that. Drag has been a staple art form in our LGBTQ plus community since forever, in my opinion, and is one where we're able to understand the way that gender has been constructed and taught to us, and been able to deconstruct it and almost make fun of the concept that is gender and the expectations, again, that we put on women in particular, where, any kind of art form can always go into the realm of being problematic. I think we always need to approach art, as artists in particular, with a critical lens of what message we're trying to convey.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always described drag as a gender exploration through art for me. And it's really been a way for me to connect and broaden community. So when I started, a lot of our drag scene was leaving. So it felt like we were rebuilding. We then had this controversial bar open right here in Winooski, which provided more opportunity for division, honestly, where we saw the separation of LGB folks and T. And it's not a new thing that we see in our community, and one that we're still kind of, working and reconnecting through. But I kept thinking, how do we bring everyone together? How do we bring everyone together? And so my drag partner, Emoji Nightmare, and I decided to do a public access television show where we focused on arts and activism, and we brought folks from varying realms to talk to us about the importance of the combination of arts and activism. And we made it through, gosh, I think we did 3 seasons, with folks ranging from Christine Hallquist, as she was
Mm.
running to be our first trans governor, to singers like the Steph Pappas Experience, to artists like Nicole Christman. We had kind of the full swath of people. And those conversations pushed us into, okay, so now we're talking about arts and activism. Sure, we're doing some performances, but what could really be the next kind of activist edge for drag queens? And we saw Drag Queen Story Hour popping up in New York City and San Francisco, and we said, okay, great, we can do that right here in Vermont. So we did. We started a Vermont chapter of Drag Queen Story Hour, and one of our intentions was to try to get outside of Chittenden County. So Vermont has 14 counties total, but a majority of our population lives in one county. And the rest of Vermont is very rural. And so our focus was, yes, we can do some of these gigs in Chittenden County, but a majority of them we want to be in the areas of Vermont where you would not expect to have Drag Queen Story Hour. And it was controversial. Our first one was actually in Emoji's hometown of Cambridge, Vermont. A very small library, I would say, not much larger than, your average apartment, though I guess I can't just say average apartment. New York City, an average
I,
apartment could be like a closet.
yeah,
So,
that's they
but
did something with all those public phone booths.
yes.
I think they rented them out.
So, but a visually small library. And when we announced it, there was a lot of controversy online. There were folks who kind of brought up the old rhetoric of considering LGBTQ folks to be pedophiles, that drag queens are meant to be in nightclubs and bars. They shouldn't be in front of children. Why would we let drag queens do this? And it was disheartening at first. I know, especially for Emoji, where she was like, I know these people who are writing these things, and I can't believe they're writing them about me, as if they don't see me at the grocery store, if they don't see me at all of these events downtown. What is going on? And I tried to take a spin on it, because I was like, I'm not going to let myself get beaten down by what's saying online, and instead add a little comedy, as we do as queens.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, controversy just means that there's going to be picketers, and picketers means that the cameras will be there, and my look will be fully appreciated at this library.
Nikki was, yeah.
She was, of course.
She was hot. Yes.
I would agree. And, but she was wrong. There were no picketers. There were no rioters. There was no one who came out against the event. Instead, what we had was 75 people from the town packed into this teeny tiny library, all with love and support. And that's what we saw every single time we did it, because we just kept going. And so when it was picked up by national media, because some woman tweeted about it and had people calling the library to get it shut down in Montpelier, our state capital, the library said, no, we're going to keep it going. And we had 150 people show up to that one, to the point that there were some folks who got to watch it outside, and then we had to do an encore outside for all the people who couldn't see it inside.
Standing room only.
Exactly. And so it was really heartwarming to see Vermont show up in such a way. And I think we've been seeing this time and time again, where even the folks who are skeptical about it and are like, I don't know if I'm going to bring my child, but like, I want to know what's going on. They come in and they're like, oh my God, this was fun.
Yeah.
It's just, you are so theatric and above it all. And the librarians would always come up to us afterwards and say, "We have never seen this many people in our library before.
Right.
There are so many families here that have never come to our library before and yet came out for this, and they got a library card and they got a selection of books, and they're going to be back." And a majority of those families were LGBTQ families who didn't know that their local library was a safe place for them, or where they could get books that were reflective of their family.
When I was a kid, I was scared of drag, in part because
Yeah.
it would have exposed me to say, I like this. But I remember that my first time at a Rocky Horror Picture Show, when I was like, okay, this is really cool, but I don't want to look like him and I don't want to act like him. But this just struck something in my core.
Gosh, I will also say, I never thought of Rocky Horror as my first intro into drag, but I guess it was, because though there was a lot going on in Pittsfield, it was the play that my high school did in my first year of high school was Rocky Horror Picture
Are
Show,
you
and I remember.
serious?
I know, such a progressive high
Wow.
school. And I remember telling my mom that I was going to watch it. And I said, I'm a little nervous because I don't like scary things. And she just laughed and was like, "I don't think you'll be
Yeah,
scared."
don't worry about that. Yep.
Uh,
I learned from Rocky Horror a little bit more of who I was when I realized I don't want to be Frank. I want to be Janet.
yes.
I want to be able to sing like that. I want to look that charming in my undergarments. And then I was like, okay, well then there's a little bit of self-awareness for you.
Yeah. See, I was always a Columbia fan.
I wasn't that outrageous.
That's where the queen comes out.
Yes, indeed. Okay, couple quick lightning questions on policy. Where are you and where is Vermont on the subject of trans athletes in high school?
Where am I? Always in support of trans folks being able to play sports as their gender. It goes beyond high school for me. I really think maybe it's because I'm not a super sports fanatic, but I think it's about teamwork and collaboration. But where Vermont is we've always been supportive of folks being able to play across gendered teams, mainly because we're a small state. So like, I remember in high school, we only had one rugby team and it was the girls team. So I played on the girls rugby team, but that wasn't because I identified as a girl. It's because there were no other options.
That was right.
And same for like football, etc. So I think it gets more complicated and nuanced when we bring identity specific into it. But I think Vermont is still very much on the leading edge of letting folks self-ID and be able to access services based on that identification.
You worked on HR 659, which was about gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth. What's the status of that?
Great question. It was, the most controversial bill that I submitted in my 2-year tenure. And it never came up for consideration in its committee of jurisdiction. I still am in full belief of bodily autonomy and that everyone should be in the driver's seat and being able to make their personal health decisions, especially when it involves a healthcare provider with informed consent. And so the main thinking behind that bill was to align our birth control statute with gender affirming care and non-surgical gender affirming care, to be more specific, so that if someone is able to go on hormonal birth control, which has unknown impacts on one's hormone production, that they should also be able to go on hormone blockers if that's going to be the most affirming thing for them in their gender journey. We shall see what the future of that bill has in Vermont, but I know that our local Republican Party was not very happy about it and actually put out a smear campaign right before election season around taking away parental rights.
Last question.
Yeah.
Will you come back sometime?
Oh, happily.
Oh.
I'd happily come back on.
Because this has been a wonderful conversation. And
I would agree.
And I'm so grateful for you taking the time. I know how busy you must be.
Oh, well, it's always great to connect with more folks and to talk about what change is really possible out there, because there's so much possible as long as we can all start to get involved in the work.
Best of luck to Taylor on November 8th, which is only a month away as I record this. This episode will drop on Friday, October 7th. Tomorrow, I'm off to Boston to record our October 21st episode about the Portraits of Pride photography exhibit. It's available on The Common and at Block C in Seaport Square. The exhibit runs from October 1st through the 29th, so get out there and see it, before the snow starts. Thanks for listening. I'm Claire McCarthy. Let's talk soon.
This is Sadie McCarthy. I'm Claire's niece. Transqat is a production of Transqat Enterprises, LLC. Copyright 2022, all rights reserved. Join us on the web at transqat.com. That's TRANSQAT.com. There, you'll find links to Transqat, the blog, writing projects, speaking engagements, and more. You can also meet the team who thought spelling cat with a Q was a good idea. Follow Transqat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Leave us a comment on whatever platform you use to stream this podcast. Just remember to be kind. She has enough self-esteem problems already. To reach Claire with a question or a suggestion for an upcoming episode, just use the contact page at the website or email her directly at crmtranscat@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.